Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Last week, in the car park, a thought came to my head. And that thought was, this week you should talk about government. And so I said, I'm going to talk about government this week. Boy, did I realise how big a topic that was. But having said that, I don't usually get warnings that I'm going to speak about a topic that far in advance. A whole week. Time to prepare. But in particular, what was going through my mind at the time was how government has come into being, where it has come from. And so I thought, as this could be a long subject, I might have to develop it over a number of different sermons. But I'm not saying I'm doing a series, because it might never happen. But what I am saying is that I want to start off, first of all, by looking at how government started. And I hope, throughout the sermon, to be able to look at one specific element of government that was from the Gentile region, which was pleasing to God. Now that might surprise you when we get into that. But before we get there, let's start with government. The Bible tells us the very first evidence that there is government is very simple. You'll find it in Genesis. In the beginning, God created. Now that aspect of God created indicates that God was working a purpose out. Now, when we get into that concept through the scriptures of what he created, we find that he created spiritual powers and principalities, and he created the earth, the physical universe. He created all the animals, the plants, everything that exists in our life today, and of course, he created us. So we see that the purpose, the very beginning of government starts with God creating. And so as he creates, he establishes order among all of his creation. Within the angelic aspect, what he does is he sets up powers and principalities. Have you ever thought what powers and principalities are? Well, a principality is generally over an area, have an area of responsibility. So, for example, if we were looking at modern government, for example, the Chancellor of the Exchequer would be a principality. He's got responsibility for the economic concepts of the whole country. You might say that the Minister of Defence, for example, the minister who looks after that concept, also has a principality. So we see that principalities means that they are over a particular area or thing. So God established this. But he also established powers. Now powers were authorities that could be ruling in different places at any one time. So for example, I'll give you an example of a power, a Prime Minister is a power. Now another example of a power would be a Lord Mayor, because he has authority over a particular smaller area, but a particular area. And so we get all of these different concepts. So the first thing we discover is that God, in the angel aspect, get the right things here, created order and responsibility. So government was established. The second thing that we notice is that he put order over the physical universe. And this is important for us to understand. We know that God commanded the sea, you go that far and no further. So this is a concept that we have. You can go so far, but no further. And that's how it works. Now, the other thing that we have is that we know that day follows night, that the sun retains its orbit on a yearly pattern, that the moon also follows after the sun and obeys the instructions that have been laid out for it. These are so accurate that using modern technology, computers, etc., we can pinpoint exact dates throughout history and project dates in history to know roughly what's happening and where everything is. We can find through the day and the hour when astronomical events happen amazing when you consider that all of that was governed. All of that is under authority. So there we see, when we look at God, we see that he understands authority. But we have to ask the question, what sort of authority is God? What sort of kingdom? And it is a kingdom, so we could say he's a monarch. But is it a monocratic? Monocracy? Monocracy. See, some of these words, they just don't work right in my teeth. So excuse that if that happens. But let's go into a concept here. Is God a monarch? Simply total power, all the rest? Or is he a different form of government? Well, let's again look at the Bible. This time, you'll find in the Gospel of John, we are introduced to a pre-period of history. In the beginning was God, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. That's John 1:1. Now, what does that mean? It means that while God existed in the beginning, there was someone else with him. And that someone else is identified as a power. In other words, as one who has authority. And he's called the Word. Now, we would have known this as he became the logos, or the spokesperson. In other words, the physical representation of the invisible God, the power behind the throne, if you like. Now, as such, we find that when anything is being enacted on the earth or within the angelic presence, it's always through the word or the authority of God that this is done. But John is sharing with us here in John, the Gospel of John, that this word is the one who ultimately became Jesus Christ, our personal Lord and Savior. So this is a very important thing. So we now can identify that the ruling God consists of at least two members of a group. Two members. Is there any more? Again, we go to Genesis. And the Spirit of the Lord hovered over the waters. This is the introduction to the third concept within this God alliance, shall we call it. I'm looking to avoid a certain word because I want to bring it in a minute. This alliance is between three beings who consider themselves equal, because we're told that Jesus, who was in the image of God, knew he was equal to God, but did not consider it important enough to stop him taking on servanthood. So we know these things. So we know that these three consider themselves as equals. But two of them accept that the Father is in charge. They have placed themselves under his authority. So there's a difference here. Now, this is a form of government that we should be very familiar with today. It's called family. And I want to bring that out. Family is government based on God. How do we know this? Have we any evidence to support it? Well, let me give you the first bit of evidence. And God created man, that's us guys, in his own image. In the image of God created he them, male and female. So we find that there's an equality. Mankind is created equally. Male and female both represent God. Both are perfect images of God. Yet we can, I think, all agree that the male and the female do not necessarily reflect each other well. There are differences, major differences. Differences in how they look, how they dress, how they present, how they think, how they act. There is major differences between the male and the female. But they are compatible together. In other words, together they can make a complete picture. And we call that picture a family. Because a family reflects the fullness of God. Now, the other thing that we notice is that when you have a family, it doesn't normally stay just a male and a female. It gradually increases. And children are born into the family aspect. So it's a government designed to look after and to increase exponentially, all the way around. That's what family is. Now, again, when we look at how God has established this and made family to be a reflection of himself, we can therefore say that it's God's intention to create family and to use family to bring forth children. Now that's a big statement. We would need something really, really important in the Bible to be able to stand up for that, wouldn't we? Yet we find there is. Throughout the scripture we find that God is looking for a bride for his son. And we know that in this present era, that bride has been identified as the church. She has been bought and paid for through the sacrifice of Jesus Christ. She has been redeemed from death and given life, and so she has been made prepared. But the marriage hasn't happened yet. She's only been prepared. She's only been made right. She's only been called into the family. She's currently, if you like, being trained her role as to what she is to do. So we can see that God is following the pattern that he established initially of how government works through a family. But here's another question. What happened to that government that God originally established over the angels? We find that the Bible tells us that one of the things that happened is there was a rebellion, a coup. We find that a third of the angels disagreed with God on a point. They didn't disagree with everything. That's very important to understand. They disagreed on one point, and that point is us. See, God had determined that we were to inherit with his son, that the bride would come from mankind, not angel kind. That God was working out his purpose through the weakness of flesh, of the physical being. And the angels, some of them at least, 1/3 to be exact, found this very hard to stomach. So they rose in revolt against this decision, and as a result, there is a separation within the government of God. And there is a factor which works contrary to God. Now, within modern politics, we would say there is an opposition to the ruling party. An opposition is there. So this opposition has gained power and authority over the earth. But how did it do that? How would it have got that power and authority? It could only have done it if it was given it as a result of either being awarded it or filling a vacuum. Filling a vacuum. Now, the situation here is that we know that what actually happened in Genesis was that a vacuum was created. And the vacuum happened because God established that Adam would be the king of this earth. As the first human being created, he would rule everything. Eve would rule with him as his queen. And their children all would be of the royal household, all the way down, because they all descend directly from God through creation. But this opposition party to God's will killed the heirs to the throne. They executed Adam through Eve. And with the vacuum that was thus created in a spiritual sense, they were able to usurp Adam's authority and position themselves in a place where they could literally take part. So understand, this is a modern term, coup. A military takeover, if you like. You kill who is there, and you simply take over until somebody moves you out of it. And this is the thing, this is what had happened all those long time ago, when Adam and Eve were first created. There was a coup. Angels took over the authority of the earth. Mankind spiritually died, unable to live. God had an option. What was he going to do? He had a choice of two things. One, he could rally his army, root out the coup, and restart. He could do that. Or two, he could bring his will into fullness through his own plans. God chose the second. One of the things we have to understand is how Satan managed to kill Adam. He did it, in a sense, by defying the Word of God. He made the Word of God of no effect. Now, this was a serious thing within the political area, because as God rules supreme over everything, to make God out wrong means that he is not as omnipotent and all-powerful as you may first have thought. In other words, they have caused God to be wrong. This is the Q's, if you like, idea. This is the rebels in the camp who have taken control of the earth. Because God had said to Adam and to Eve, live and prosper and multiply over the whole earth. He had told them that. And they died. And as a result of that, God's word became void. If God was to, at this point, say, I've had enough, wipe out them archangels, take them in judgments for the rest of eternity and restart the whole thing, he would still have this problem that at one point his word was void and didn't come back to him completely. This would be a problem that couldn't remain. Therefore, it was important that that word, live, become a reality within humanity that God had created through Adam. Very important thing to understand. We have to understand why God has done what he does when he does it. I'm using a very long introduction here. Because we haven't even got to the meat of the stuff yet. We're still in the vegetables. The soup, really. But I wanted to explain this to you because it's very, very important to understand. We know that when Adam subsequently was put out of the garden and he began to obey God in the sense of having children and started to multiply on the earth, that concept was done. Unfortunately, he was dead spiritually, but the rest of it was being performed. A rebellion happened within his own family. Now, this is the first human rebellion. The rebellion was between two brothers, Cain and Abel. And that rebellion resulted in the death of one. So we know that rebellion against authority leads to death, destruction, change. And we've seen that already. The angels rebelled against God. Adam died. We died as such. When Cain and Abel were rebelling against the teachings of God and the teachings that Adam had given them, what he had been taught, when that rebellion happened, Abel died. But we look now and we see something. Human government is about to be introduced to the earth, but it's a very small aspect of human government. We know that God's government rules through Adam, but human government rules with the authority of the rebels. In other words, it has to have authority coming from God, either through the rebellion, because they're still recognized as a part of God's kingdom, because they fell back, or directly from God. So you have two strands of government coming, through the world or through God, through the Spirit. Okay? That's the two ways that we have to understand this. Cain, after he had been rejected by God, a mark was put upon him and he was sent away. He went away and he began to build a city. Now, what's a city? Well, it's a lot of blocks put together to build a house, and you do all of them together, and suddenly you've got more than one. And you can do this until it becomes a city. I mean, we can look at it that simple. But if you have a city, if you've got a lot of people living together and you're building up that aspect, what you're really doing is forming a mini government. Remember we mentioned the concept of a Lord Mayor. Well, the Lord Mayor can be over a city. It means he stands in power over a particular concept of the government of that city. He's the figure. And that's what Cain had done. He had started the first man-led government on the earth when he built that city. We don't hear much about that city because it got washed out, literally. But we don't need to worry too much about that. Because the next government that we see, from a biblical standpoint, is one that was started in the time of Noah. Now this is a very important government because it represents government from God. But we learn that Noah had a great-grandson who kind of disagreed. But let me explain why he disagreed. Because this is something we need to get into our heads. We need to understand this. Noah was told by God to go out of the ark, multiply, replenish the earth, and cultivate the entire planet. He was told to do that. Problem is, he's got 3 sons and 4 wives. Not him. The sons had 1 wife each, and he had a wife, so there was 8 of them altogether. Now, it was obvious that when God had said that, he didn't mean them all to separate off in twos and head off to different countries. First, they had to grow to become a powerful enough people to be able to start separating. This took 4 generations. And so we see that the great-grandson of Noah, an individual who is known as Nimrod, is described in the Bible as one who became a mighty hunter against the Lord. Now in English, we're not sure if that's good or bad. But in original context, we recognize that what this is a description of something meaning a different thing. For instance, a hunter, today we would say a mighty warrior. But they didn't have warriors, because they didn't have wars. There was the first thing, they didn't have wars. Man's hunting skills was to protect him against the increase of wild animals that could have attacked against them. So, and of course to go out and be able to forage for food and hunt for food. So the skilled hunter became expert in weapons for defensive purposes. But it could be used as a means of warfare. So the very first concept of hunting reflects also warfare. It's warfare against animals. But it's going to become warfare against men. And that's what Nimrod was noticed. He had always heard, the same as everyone else who lived at that time, they all knew, because Noah was still alive, Noah was still there. He lived 350 years after the flood, and this happened well within that time frame. But here's the interesting bit. He disagreed. He said, if we all separate now into different parts of the world, then we're going to lose our identity. We're going to lose who we are. You know, I'm amazed sometimes because you listen to modern politics and you realise, that's Nimrod. He's talking. Because it's the exact same argument. Nimrod's argument was, if we all separate, we lose our national identity, we will become intermingled with other peoples. We will lose who we are, and different cultures will suddenly appear, and will not be strong anymore. If, on the other hand, we were to stay together as one mighty nation and establish a name for ourselves here, as we grow, then we can take more and more territory as we require it. Now, I want to ask you, seriously, given the way I've just put the argument, would you think that because it makes sense. And that was the strength of Nimrod. He was a hunter, yes, but he was literally opposing the will of God. God had said, separate. Go out into the different parts of the world. Populate the earth. And Nimrod said, we would be safer staying together and becoming a great nation, a great country, a great power, and gradually taking it over. Now, because we need to understand that, we see that in Babel, which Nimrod had established as his capital, that, and this is the best bit, they decided to put a monument to their decision that they were of one mind and one dream. That monument was called the Tower of Babel. Now, very important thing about this, it's at this point that God decides to intervene. That means that the government of God decides to put their will into the matter and force a decision. And God does it in a unique way. First of all, he goes to explore, or if you like, investigate what the problem really is. So we find that the Bible says God came to earth. And we find that God didn't come to earth singularly, he came plural. More than one representation of God came to examine this. So there's a council of God. Not a council of angels, a council of God. And this council of God has to make a decision. And they determine. What we do is divide the languages. And the people will split. So there we have God directly intervening on man's modern political ambitions. He confused their languages. And by confusing their language, the result was amazing. Certain families understood each other. Other families, they were talking total gobbledygook. It was ridiculous. And you know, the problem is when you're trying to work with somebody, and you're saying, pass me the wrench, and they're going, jata blah. Yeah, you get the wrench yourself, but you're not going to ask them for anything anymore. And so, suddenly everything's falling apart. And before long, the people who all could understand each other began to separate into little bits of, well, we don't know how long this took, but we get the impression that it might have happened within a year period. Because they began to separate, they began to be suspicious. Because they couldn't master each other's language. They couldn't learn it. Now this was not to remain, but for this period of time, God prevented them from being able to consider or learn the separate languages. So it literally was them people over the road speak a different tongue from me. Don't understand who they are. And if I don't understand what they are, maybe they think differently from me. If they think differently from me, maybe they don't like me. Maybe the way they talk is actually talking about me. So before long, everything starts to split out and open up and people start spreading. Nimrod's plan failed drastically. And there we should say government think and stop. But it didn't. Because everywhere those people went became tribes and countries and nations and powers of their own. We're getting started now, honestly. Because it starts with the fact that God determined that he needed a representation of his kingdom to be established on the earth. Noah was old, coming towards the end of his life. And God wanted, literally, to be able to move his authority from Noah, who was recognized as a Gentile, to someone that he could work with on a one-to-one basis, and through them have a representation of his kingdom on the earth. He chose a man from Babel. He chose a man from that area. His name was Abraham. And we know that the story of Abraham was that he was approached by God, and that God said to him, leave your father's house, leave the country of your birth, leave this area, for I am going to take you to another land which I will give your descendants. 430 years after the children of Israel went into Egypt, God began to open up that promise that he had made to Abraham with the calling out and freeing of the children of Israel. Now, I'm going to jump ahead a little. You'd think that if you were given all the laws and all the personal attention of God, that Israel as a nation, as the 12 tribes, that you would think that they themselves would, not only have a good opinion of themselves, but would know, well, I obey God because he's God. But it was strange. Every time this nation went to do anything, the first thing that it did was it walked away from God. It was fascinated by all the gods of all the nations around it. It followed them and lusted after them and wanted them, while still having all the benefits and protection that was being offered by God. The Bible often views Israel as a marriage relationship with God. And because God's got them very much his family, we can understand why he always looks this way at it. He said that he married Israel. And he separates Israel into two camps after this divide of the kingdom. And we see this in the prophecies of Jeremiah. He very much brings it across. Israel is split into two different daughters. And the two daughters were Israel and Judah. Now, the older sister is Israel, because at one time they were all just one people. And God had married into them. But when she had separated herself, the ones that remained, Judah, he had married also, a separate covenant with them. And the reason for that was so that the Messiah could be born out of Judah. But then, God had enough. I mean, you do. Sometimes it's just too much to bear. And he put Israel away. He put them away by sending them into the Gentile nations through giving them over into slavery to a country called Assyria. Now, Assyria was a mighty nation, but never was a world power. In fact, it's not until Israel is gone and Judah has started to show that she's going to even be worse than Israel ever was, that God reveals in the Bible for the first time that he is going to bring about not the government of this earth. God is going to bring about a world governing kingdom. A world governing kingdom. That kingdom isn't going to be Jewish. It's not Israel. It's a Gentile nation. And guess where he goes back to find it? Back to Babylon. God's first world government is Babylon. And it's under a particular king, Nebuchadnezzar. Now, I want to introduce you. We have another 5 or 6 minutes to go before we have to break this. And it is going to have to go into 2 parts. I'm sorry, folks. That's just the way it is. I want to introduce you to this king, Nebuchadnezzar. First of all, I want to tell you a little bit about his kingdom. Well, to be more exactly, about Babylon itself. To get you an idea of the size, at this time, which was approximately the 6th, 7th century BC. 6th, 7th century BC. Babylon, the city, covered a total of 200 square miles. It was a big city. The city itself could boast 250 watchtowers around its walls. The walls themselves were 87 feet thick. Do you understand? We're not talking, something that's just been pulled up here. When Nebuchadnezzar rebuilt and organized Babylon, he designed it with perfection. Let me just quote here from this. He laid the city out in rectangular blocks. He built the houses and dwellings of brick. He faced them with enamel clay tiles, which he coloured blue, yellow and white. The houses all rose up to 4 stories high. And he lined broad avenues. He put in gardens, streams and parks all throughout the city. This was a wonder of the world. We know about the hanging gardens, for example. We've heard about them before. But that wasn't all he did. He also had other engineering feats that he undertook. Babylon was set on or beside the river Euphrates. And let's put it, if you want to get across a river, it's a bit difficult, especially if it's a river like the Euphrates, which is quite big. So he wanted to get a bridge over it, but being Nebuchadnezzar, he wanted to be able to go over it more than one at a time. So he built it 30 feet wide for the length of 660 feet, right across bank to bank. But that's fine if you want to go over in a nice day, but what if it's raining? See, he also decided it would be useful to be able to go big carts and all the rest under the river. So he built a tunnel under the river, 12 foot high, 15 foot wide, and he connected from bank to bank. Now think of modern cities, and think of what I've just described. And you realise there's a very much, the technology required, we say, we can do that today because. He was doing that approximately 600 years before Jesus Christ was born. Do you understand? That was the technology that was available to them. These are amazing feats. Now, I want you to understand this. I don't want you to get the idea that while this is the first world government, that nothing but good is about it. This city is renowned for its paganism. I mean, you've no idea. Within its walls, it had 53 individual temples to separate deities. Temples now, not just places of worship, temples. Concerning the individual deities, though, it had at least 1,327 separate shrines where you could make sacrifices to the various deities. The central focus that anyone would have seen in Babylon was its famous ziggurat that rose 7 flights, 7 heights. And at the top, there was a massive place to make sacrifice. Many people have said for many long time, for 100 years, that this may well have been the original Tower of Babel itself. This ziggurat. Others disagree that, but that's not the important thing. But I said that it was spectacular. To give you an idea, it rose 650 feet in height. Let's see, give you an idea of what that would be. The greatest other building at that time was called the Great Pyramid in Egypt, which is massive. This towered over it. Just to give you an idea. I want to keep on this pagan thing because it's important to understand. Babylon had a habit. Do you know what they did? They named their streets, which they had lots of them, 200 square miles, it's a lot of streets. They named all their streets after the individual deities that they worshipped in the city. They named them after that. And when the priests in Babylon, how can we describe them? They were a government unto themselves, because they were anointed by the king, appointed by the king, for the purpose of actually ensuring that all of these gods and deities were properly addressed and dealt with. Because this was very important. When you're a big culture that's moving out, you don't want to offend them. Do you understand? Very simple. Wisdom in this. And he would have got this wisdom, ironically, from Solomon. You might be surprised at that. Because Solomon was the wisest king who ever was, and all the nations about thought his wisdom on different things. And what did Solomon do? He says, well, one of the things is you make peace with everybody. He married into every royal family around him. He made peace with everyone. Nebuchadnezzar is doing the exact same thing, only he's recognizing that every place that he has been, every nation he's overtaken, everybody that he's brought into captivity have their own gods. And those gods might at some point get a little bit upset with him. And so, to appease them, he establishes all these deities. Do you understand? That's why he's doing this. And just to give you a rough idea, in the 9th century BC, there was a census which is still available. Right? You can actually access this. That census totaled that the gods that were officially worshipped in Babylon were 65,000 in total. So, to say that this was a pagan city is no under exaggeration. Interesting concept. How they worked their taxation, they didn't bother getting money to the king. All these gods had to be, you taxed the gods. So if you worshipped a god, you had to pay a tax to the king for to allow that god to be taxed, to be that god to be worshipped. So you literally taxed the god 65,000. I mean, you're going to keep these going, aren't you? You wouldn't do it. It became rich, powerful, strong. Okay, I'm going to leave this to you guys. I am going to go over time if I continue. Or I can take it up at another time. I want you to decide. Do you want me to speak for another 5 minutes to get where I'm going? Mm-hmm. You still? You happy with that? Happy with another 5 minutes? Okay. Why I'm asking that is because of this reason. When we look at Nebuchadnezzar, we have to understand that he is not a king who is easily led. He has the best example of counselors and advisors and magicians and all the rest. And we're introduced to this through the book of Daniel. Daniel, as a young Hebrew, when the Jews were overtaken by Babylon, was brought in the first wave, and he was trained along with three of his friends for the purpose of being a king's advisor, a wise man, one of the government. So he was brought into the very government of the king. And it's in Daniel 2 that we are introduced to this concept of God's view on Babylon, because the king has a dream. And in his dream, he sees a statue. Now, this is a massive, brutal statue. It towers in the wilderness, and there's nothing else around it. And the king had looked at the statue, and he was awed. And he looked at what happened to the statue, and he couldn't believe it. And the problem is, he woke in the morning, and he said, I have just been given a revelation. And I forgot it. Oh boy. He forgot it. He forgot everything that he had seen, but he knew it was important. He knew it was the most important thing he ever had seen. He knew this was relevant. So, he's the king. He's the top. Nobody above him. What he says goes. He calls all his advisors, all his officials, all the magicians, all the soothsayers, everybody. And he says to them, I had a dream last night, which is very important. I need you to tell me what the dream means, but I also need you to tell me what the dream was, because I cannot recall it. And you can see the fear literally ripple around the room. And one of the more advanced and seasoned counselors of the king came forward and said, can remember even the littlest bit of the dream, it'll all come back. And then we can explain it to you. The king just said, look, I'll tell you what. This was given to me by a God. This was given to me by someone of more power and authority than me. This is a kingdom that I do not know about. If you can't tell me what this message is, then you aren't worth having in my government. So we give an order. Kill them. Kill their families. Kill their children. Kill their animals. Take their houses. Pummel them. Make them mint. Literally dung heaps. So that nobody will ever live in that place again. So that people will know that if you are of power and authority given to you by the king, you live up to what you're expected to do. Because if you don't, there's going to be a consequence. I want you to remember that. Because that's one of the things that God likes about Nebuchadnezzar. He knows authority and he understands it. He understands it. And it's important things that we need to know. Of course, Daniel and his friends all fall foul of this. But I want you to look at this. Daniel says to the guard who's just arrested him and taken him to prison to kill him, that he, if he's given time, can get the answer from the king. He only needs a night. He'll know in the morning. Now, here is something that we need to understand. Many people paint Nebuchadnezzar as a despot, you know, a real horror. But look at this guard, This is a captain of the guard. At the end of the day, he's only a military man. He's got no value. But he knows that it's important to the king to know the answer. So instead of fulfilling the king's command, he stops everyone and makes arrangements to go and see the king. He says to the king, while I was undertaking your work to gather the people together for their destruction, I come across one of the Hebrews. And he said to me that he can get you the answer if you wait till tomorrow, providing you don't kill them. Now think about that. You're just in the army. You're a grunt for all intent and purpose, right? So what are you going to say to the mightiest king in all the world? Are you going to challenge his authority? Are you going to tell him maybe they should not kill everybody for a while? Yet that was the relationship that this king allowed with his people. He allowed them to be able to come and approach him and talk to him. He took notice of what was being said to him. He sought counsel from the masses. A unique thing for a king of his time. I think you'll agree. But this again shows us why he is the head of gold. This kingdom. Because it was open to instruction, yet knew its authority. We know that the king listened to that soldier, and the next day when Daniel was brought before him, Daniel addresses the king in a fashion that is not common for the Jews. They don't praise anyone. It's just not done. Because they think all praise goes to God, so therefore we can't do that. And many have died for it before. Yet Daniel, being a prophet, speaks on God's behalf about this king. And you really need to think about what he said. You, Almighty King, have been given power and authority over all the nations of this earth, over everything, as a gift from our God, because you are his servant to do his purpose at this time. You, O King, are the head of gold. Obviously, we have to take this further. I thank you for the time that you've given me just to get to that point. And hopefully, we can continue this the next time.